I've been buzzing around education now for better than 30 years in the companies I created, Princeton Review and then 2U and Noodle, and companies I've been on the boards of, and nonprofits in terms of charter schools and independent schools in the US. I have a couple observations that might be useful, and I thought I would slide through them very quickly. One, in terms of raising money, just a piece of advice. David Rose created an incredible TEDx talk on raising money from VCs. I highly recommend it. Everything I know is a subset of what he knows, so I won't go into it. But one thing that I think about a lot, I've invested in probably 3 dozen EdTech companies at this point, startups, is that nobody really understands TAM, and if they do understand it, they misrepresent it. Like really understanding what is the potential market for your product or service is a critical part of doing a startup, and it's a part that people kind of whistle past the graveyard all the time. They do not take it seriously. What are people spending money on now that because you exist, they will spend it, either they'll spend less of it or they'll get much more for it, and what are you replacing? In terms of exit, also, I feel strongly I've had 2 public exits, and hopefully Noodle will be a 3rd. It's a path. It's a long, very painful path, but it is a path. Knowing what you're going to do, having a vision for how this thing comes out the other end, is really interesting to investors, actually critical. To angel investors, our belief that you know how you're going to raise Series A, to Series A investors, how you're going to eventually sell or make the company liquid is everything. In terms of culture, a lot of people doing startups, especially in the education space, look for partners. I'm not a big fan of partners, and I'm really not a fan of 50-50 partnerships. If you have a vision for doing something, build a company, bring in people as you need them, give them plenty of options, give them equity in your company, but in general, the notion of capitalism is that if I have this Diet Coke and you want it, and you give me $2 and I accept it, it means I'd rather have the $2 than the Diet Coke, and you would rather have the Diet Coke than the $2. It's an optimization. In employees of startups, we believe that everybody's motivated by equity. And in fact, a lot of really talented people just have mortgages. Like they just need to actually make cash. And so assuming that everybody is as motivated as you are by equity is a huge error, and you create a pessimal relationship. In terms of life cycle, one of the smartest people I know I brought here last night, Amir Kafir, who was with the Adizes Institute and now separately consults. And what they speak about in terms of the life cycle of a company, moving from, if you think about companies as people, and I told you about a guy and he's sort of bimodal. He's crying and then he's laughing and then he's crying again, and he sometimes gets so upset that he's almost incoherent, and then he shits his pants. And I said, he's 6 months old, right? There are problems that are good problems. They are predictable and they are appropriate. And then if he's 40 years old, less so. Knowing where you are in a life cycle of a company is a critical part of understanding and helping your employees understand where you are. And the most interesting stage for me is GoGo, where one of my companies is now. It is, you've survived infancy. You brought the company in, you've hit market fit, you're growing very quickly, and you have no systems at all. You don't really think about compensation as a system. You think about it as a series of deals. You have no corporate structure. You have no processes. And the process of getting out of GoGo and moving into adolescence and then prime is a critical and ongoing conversation. And watching companies mentoring them through that first arc is interesting. At some point, you will come way too close to running out of money. There's nothing quite like it in business, the feeling of, I don't know if I can hit payroll. And it happens to everybody in here. It's happened to everybody who presented here. Try not to have that happen. Like, look, your job as CEO is that your company's funded for the next 9 to 12 months. And entrepreneurship is about a series of financial events. In general, you're raising money for 1 to 2 years out. And the way to think of it is you're probably, each time you're raising money, giving away about 20% of the company to fund that next stage of growth. And so just as a rough calculus. In terms of product fit, my saying with my company is that the plural of focus is lack of focus. That EdTech companies think that they can play in K-12 and higher ed and life learning, that they can be B2C and B2B. There is no successful startup in the past 100 years that's been any two of those, right? You're a K-12 B2C, you're a higher ed B2B, whatever you are, be that, and do it really well. And if you have to pivot and hit a different area, it's okay. But again, the track record of anybody trying to be more than that, more than one box in that matrix is over. In terms of backward design, I use this slide just because I think that might have been the coolest thing I'd ever seen. But the notion of solving a problem, there are a lot of solutions in search of problems in that hallway and in education in general. People like right now with Bitcoin and crypto, they have a real solution and they're looking for problems in education to solve. And I'm skeptical. Start with the problem. What is the problem you're trying to solve? And then look around other industries for the tools to fix them. Education is also very, very weak on metrics. What are you really trying to do? And right from the start, building in the measures to prove that you're doing it. Don't wait until you're down the road to start the questioning of how do you know you're effective. I'm just going to skip over some of these because I'm going to run out of time and hit just a couple of other things that I think are just useful things to think about. I gave a talk once about the pudgy startup. There's lean startup methodology. I highly recommend the book by Reese. It is brilliant in terms of a methodology and a way of thinking. But my concern is that education is a very inertial space. It's all about trust. In lean startup methodology, there's a concept called the MVP, the minimally viable product. Get something out in the market and have people respond to it instead of building the perfect thing and then hopefully people care. Like if you didn't get it right the first time, you're already millions of dollars in. The problem in education is that none of us are really interested in having your MVP on our kid. And no educator's that interested in having your MVP on their kids. And so it's a slower moving, trust-based place. You have to be funded much more seriously than a similar startup in another area. You have to have patient investment and a lot of it. And then I've thought more and I realized that there are a bunch of companies that spend way too much money and that the pudgy startup was a terrible idea also. The right answer is a fit startup, is thinking hard about what is the right amount of funding you need and what's the right amount of proof before you go to market. And it's a calibration. To me, the big problems that we're here to solve in 2 minutes and 45 seconds, one, in K-12, it is that both the US and Israel are not educating our underclass, and they are an underclass at this point, and a persistent problem. And the problem in K-12 is efficacy, is can we do a better job, not educating rich kids, but educating less advantaged kids. Those are the rankings internationally on tests like PISA. There's some really interesting stuff coming in neuroscience in particular, some brilliant work coming out of labs all over the world. the way we govern our K-12 schools makes it very unlikely that those ideas and those techniques are going to get into kids' heads in any kind of reasonable time frame. How do we, as entrepreneurs, help get things into people's heads more quickly in a more agile way? One of the problems that I see outside and that I see continually also in K-12 is the tension between adaptive learning, you learn at your own pace, and social learning. You learn primarily with other people. If everybody's doing their own thing, how do we learn together? Very few people have solved it. It's an ongoing problem, and the keys to the kingdom to whoever can. In higher ed, the problem in the US is cost. That is the average tuition over the past several years in the US. The problem here is different. And I would say that the problem in both places is largely misunderstood. There are a lot of people who believe, smart people, that we are 40 years away from the end of work, right? Like the OECD is saying this. I don't think that's true, but it's directionally correct. We're entering a time of tremendous change and disruption. The need for a liberal arts education, the need for people who are just smart and agile has never been greater, because millennials are going to have 5 careers, 25 jobs, and I think that's an underestimate. How do we educate not for the job force right now, but to create people who are going to be employed in good jobs continually and learn how to learn? And the transition from one block of learning, and that's your career, to ongoing bouts of learning is, I think, the 800-pound gorilla in both countries. In the US, there's some headwind in terms of demographics and immigration, and that guy. And overall, in both K-12 and higher ed, a movement towards what I'll call agile learning. If right now we're in the foothills of online education, and we think of online over here and campus-based over here, whereas certainly 5 years from now, just as Amazon Go is a blend and Walmart's acquisition of Jet and all sorts of things like that, you will see a much more fluid line between online and classroom, and getting there is, I think, a market opportunity. Finally, what online is doing in both K-12 and higher ed is likely to change governance. That is the number of newspapers in the US over the past 20 years. Every industry has a line like that, because online learning creates great capacity in the education institutions that are doing it. You're going to see many more people getting higher education, as these guys were saying a moment ago, but you're going to see it in many, many fewer schools. And that shakeout is going to be painful, that consolidation of the space. I'll leave you with one last thing that my brother tells me all the time, and he's right, is sometimes when everybody says you're wrong, it's because you're wrong. And I learned that slowly. Thank you.